Okay, here we are, part 2, red fruit. I've changed locations. Hopefully the sound's going to be okay. It's a little echoey in here, so let me know. I think it'll be all right. So yesterday went through the beginning processes of sort of setting the table for writing about red fruit. And today I'm going to go into my second stage, which would be deep research. And I always do deep research on topics anymore. So much so that a lot of what I end up doing these days is kind of half information, half stand-up. So I do a lot of one-person shows that once I find something I think is really interesting, if there's enough there as stimulating information, then I try to turn it into a full one-person show. So let's do this with red fruit. The deep research process, essentially that means now you can go to ChatGPT and sort of pull up lots of different things very quickly. You can ask it to keep going deeper and deeper when you find things that you like. You can still do Wikipedia, or you can still do a general Google search. So the things I'm looking for when I do research, deep research to set up comedy bits, first of all, very stimulating information. When I read it, I'm like, oh, I never knew that. That's interesting. Where did that come from? So I'm looking for that spark reaction. And you'll find a lot of stand-up especially is really built on stimulating information. You have to turn it into comedy after that quickly, but stand-up that has really extra gears that really works also is very, very interesting information coming out. It's things you haven't heard before, it's new, it's fresh, it has a certain information quality. Second thing I'm looking for is what is odd or absurd in the things that I'm reading. So this is really, you see this a lot in the news, like if you're writing news jokes, finding crazy stories that are just unexpected, usually coming out of Florida. Florida woman shoots rocket into ex-husband's front seat. So there's always some kind of odd, absurd angle, and that opens it up quickly to comedy. Third, is it funny when you read it? Do you just laugh about some kind of concept within the research itself? Fourth, is it insightful? Does it actually solve some kind of problem? Do people, when they hear this piece of information, are they going to think that's useful? And finally, is it stand-up worthy? And stand-up is the ultimate criteria because it's so fast and it's so dense, and it's really just a collection of punchlines. No matter how you repackage it, you can repackage it as stories or as meanders or whatever format you prefer your comedy delivered to you, but it's really just a bunch of punchlines coming through some kind of format. So the areas that I pulled up from red fruit that I like, and we'll go through some of the things I found that I like at this point, are first of all, tomatoes. I'm gonna go through a little bit of the comedy that I built because I spent about 30 minutes on this earlier, doing this deep research and then kind of turning out some of the things that I thought would be maybe useful. So even if I was doing this as stand-up, I usually start with questions to the audience, and a lot of times I'll go back and get those and excise those questions out of the bit. But I usually start with something to, again, sort of stimulate people intellectually. So if I were to ask anybody here like tomatoes, does anybody like tomatoes? The human organ of plants. It's like a pancreas on a vine. You bite into it and literally like capillaries and tissue and cartilage spills out. I don't know how anybody eats a tomato without vomiting for 3 straight days because it's the most disgusting human organ-like thing I've seen on a vine. And that's because it's an ovary. Like literally all fruit is just an ovary of the plant that grew up to a certain size, contains seeds, so that you will go out and propagate it somewhere else if you're a mammal. You're eating an ovary, which is not nearly as fun as a great idea for vegans. That, oh yeah, we're ovary eaters. We eat ovaries. So every tomato you eat is a mass abortion. Congratulations. Most of those seeds never get planted. They just go away. Try that one. Right to lifers or whatever the term is these days. So that's the first thing. So I turned this into using emotion, which is disgust, because I feel complete disgust about tomatoes. I did some research and found out, I never realized that fruit is basically an ovary. It's there designed to propagate the plant itself by getting the seeds distributed. And botanically, another interesting thing about tomatoes that I found is that tomatoes have two identities. They're both vegetable and fruit, which sounds impossible until you actually go in and do the research and realize that they are fruits because they have seeds and they grow from ovaries. So they're scientifically a fruit, but legally they're a vegetable in America. Because in the 1890s, there was a court case decided by the Supreme Court that declared tomatoes vegetables. So if you think our Supreme Court is, doing crazy things, the other Supreme Courts, if it doesn't do things like trying to decide whether something's a vegetable. And that's because tariffs. Somebody was trying to avoid paying a tariff on vegetables because fruits, I guess, didn't have tariffs. So they declared it a vegetable. And then everybody else was like, oh, it's a vegetable. And so the ordinary understanding of tomatoes is that it's a vegetable because it's not sweet, it's not a dessert thing. And so now it's legally declared a vegetable, even though it's a fruit. Welcome to America. Some other things I found, I talked about this in the first part one, that in Buñol, Spain, there's the La Tomatina festival, where every year, literally tens of thousands of people walk through the streets getting hit with tomatoes, over 100 tons of ripe tomatoes. It goes on for an hour. Everything, the streets are just literally up to your knees in tomatoes at a certain point. And there's some things about this, like you have to pre-squash the tomatoes so that they don't cause brain damage when you throw them from a rooftop and hit somebody in the temple. So there are rules around how you get to attack people with tomatoes. So there's probably something more in that. So those are the two main things I found about tomatoes, but there's probably plenty more, and I may do some more of that research because I think tomatoes could actually be something that could, because it's that conflict in there. Like, I find them entirely disgusting. Other people love tomatoes. And I love the taste of tomatoes as long as they're in tomato sauce. But there's a thing called mouthfeel for when human beings eat, that if the mouthfeel is off, it can make you throw up. And that's the way I feel about basically all fruit. The other three that I pulled out are cherries, red bananas, kind of an interesting thing that I have never thought about. And then there are red apples that have red flesh. Like, there's a variety of apple that when you bite through the skin, it's also red inside, which is a lot of red. That's an awful lot of red to eat. Double red. I'm not sure I could eat that either. Red bananas are grown in East Africa, and South Asia. They taste weird. They taste like like banana mixed with raspberry. So they're kind of a berry taste. And they're considered an aphrodisiac, because why not? It's a red banana. We can say anything we want about it. Isn't everything considered an aphrodisiac in some culture? Some things about cherries real quick, and then we'll sort of talk about how you write these things on the next, into stand-upable material. The cherry tree is the first thing I always think of with cherries. George Washington cut down the cherry tree, and when confronted about it, said, when he was like 7 years old, "I cannot tell a lie, I did it." What 7-year-old talks like that? And what kind of psychotic 7-year-old is going around cutting down really nice fruit trees? Just walking around with an axe, you give them to your 7-year-old. Was that the colonial days? They all got axes at 5. So there's probably some stuff in there. George Washington's a very funny character. That story was actually completely made up by a preacher named Parson Weems. Great name. He just made it up 40 years after Washington died. He wrote a biography of the guy and wanted to make him into a godlike figure. And so even as a child, it's kind of the same story of Jesus, like in the temple as a child, being far beyond his years in morality. So there's that. There's a lot of George Washington stuff. Clearly, he was the tallest president, I think he was. He could have played in the NBA at the time. And I actually did a Sora video of George Washington talking trash in the NBA. And it came out pretty funny with him getting in somebody's face saying, "Hey, I just Valley Forged you," and So it's pretty funny to mix those two worlds. Some other things about cherries: the pit contains cyanide. When crushed, it comes out. So you could literally, if you ate too many cherry pits, you could die of cyanide poisoning. But nobody ever eats cherry pits, so it's not really a point. They've been banned actually in major cities because at different times in history, because people were spitting all the pits everywhere. I don't know if cherries are mostly pit, and that pit is not messing around. It's like it's like a peach pit. It's very hard and it's very dangerous. If you swallow it, you're going to die. So this is also an odd fruit that tries to kill you. There's lots of varieties of cherries. There's a variety called Black Republican, which I need to find out more about. As soon as I saw that, I thought that was something I could use. There's cherry records for cherry pits. The farthest pit spit was 93 feet. And the most stems tied with your tongue, 14 in 1 minute. So there's the deep research stage of this writing. I've now got a lot of stuff in here that, depending on what I want to, how much material I want to create, that I can go back into and now start shaping it into stand-up. And that's what I'll do in part 3, is I'll dive back in here to this comedy research, this stimulating information research, or this odd or absurd or unusual information that people don't already know, so that it's stimulating when they hear it. And I'll start carving this into an actual bit around each one of these things and see how much I can get out of it. So in part 3, I'll turn this into bits. And then I think in part 4, that'll probably be plenty, I'll perform it and we'll see how it comes out. Most stand-up, even though you go through the writing process with this, you can cook it to a certain level, but it's got to be taken up in front of real people. That secondary cooking process of, hey, we think this script is good and it's going to work, is totally unpredictable how it's actually going to work live. It's got to factor in the character that's delivering it, the audience that's receiving it, the venue. All these things affect the quality of the response. But stand-up is almost always co-cooked with live audiences. Because if you don't, 40%, 60%, 80% of it, 100% of it won't work. It has to be turned into an oral communication format. And that's a tough scripting for most people. Most people don't have a lot of experience doing oral script at all, and they definitely don't have a lot of experience doing stand-up script. So most people have some kind of speech background. At some point you took a public speaking class, and you kind of know what it's like to write oral script from that. But stand-up is very different. So that's what we'll work on in part 3, is what does it mean to turn something like this, red fruit bits, which are now, we have 4 major areas to work on, into actual stand-up script. So pop back in tomorrow and hit comments in there, subscribe to the channel. Let me know how this sounds, because again, I'm just sort of experimenting with it until we get it to where it works.